Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Excited today to be talking to a fellow Marylander. We're talking with Amy Kehs, who, among other things, works with a great program, has something called Love My Museum. Some of you may be familiar with it because she's also a podcaster. But it's not only sort of an approach, but a communications tool that she provides for museums of all sizes. And we're going to talk about what that looks like and ways to think about communicating museum and history work, which at this moment in time is just so important, getting our message out there and sort of cutting through all the noise. But before we get there, we love to get to know folks. So Amy, where did you grow up? What led you to get involved in this specific line of communications work?
Hi, Nick. Thank you so much for having me. So I grew up in Berlin, Maryland, and worked summer jobs in Ocean City. My parents took my sister and I to the museums in Washington, D.C., to Colonial Williamsburg, to national parks. And I loved museums and tourist attractions growing up. I really loved paying attention to how these places delivered customer service and how they really made you feel. And I also loved helping the people that came to my summer jobs in Ocean City and making them feel welcome in my town. But I didn't really know how to translate that to a career. And I was a small town girl who went off to the big city for college, in my case, Washington, D.C., and I was a sophomore at American University in Washington, D.C., and I was still undecided. And I was about to leave for a semester abroad in London. It was the week of finals, and my advisor called and told me that I needed to pick a major before I left to go to London. And I panicked. And my roommate was a public communications major. And so I picked that. I got to London, and part of our program was you had to have an internship, and it had to be based in your major. So I interned at a major global public relations firm. And honestly, I was miserable. It wasn't a great internship. They didn't really know what to do with me. And I knew I loved being in London. I loved my semester abroad, but the internship was a different story. And I knew that when I got back to campus, I was going to meet with my advisor and change my major. But before that happened, I went to a volunteer fair on campus, and there was a table for the Smithsonian, and I signed up. And I was placed in the public affairs office at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and I loved it. I learned so much. I volunteered for all of my junior year and senior year of college, and I was offered a job just a few months before I graduated. And that was my first museum job.
That's like the ultimate museum job too, right?
Yes.
Like it's like, yeah, my first museum, you maybe never heard of it, the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
So you worked there. Tell us about your experience at the Smithsonian.
It was great. It was the best work family ever. We still keep in touch. Shout out to my Air and Space family because I know that they're listening and they're cheering. That group that I worked with in the 90s, we still get together once a year for reunions. We have Zoom calls. It was a great first job. I had all those summer jobs in Ocean City, but it was my first real job. And it was just such a great learning environment. one of the first events as a volunteer slash intern that I was able to work on all by myself. Like put everything that you learned at the museum and also in the classroom and put it into practice. And it was the White Wings paper airplane contest. And I did all the things. I wrote the press release. I did the media advisory. I made the pitch calls. I sent it to the media list. And we had an amazing turnout that day. Now, I know now that a lot of that it was a slow news day. There were a lot of other factors. But at the end of the day, I was so excited. I remember jumping in the elevator with my boss and saying, like, I can do this. I can do PR. And he, of course, kind of giggled at me that, well, yeah, there are always other factors involved with public relations. And so it was a really great first job. It was a great experience.
And how long were you there before you kind of do the work that you do today? What's the path from the Smithsonian to Love My Museum?
So in 2000, I launched my own public relations consulting business. And for the first 20 years of that business, I was a consultant. I was an extra set of hands on big projects. I was doing media relations and helping museums and other small businesses get the word out about their event, managing events, making sure that things ran smoothly, doing that media relations work. And when the pandemic hit, museums had to shut their doors. And I had to rethink how I worked. And so I dug in. I had a daughter who was about to go off to college, and I needed to find another way to work. So I took courses, I read everything I could, I talked with experts, and I discovered the online business space where I helped clients across industries and around the world. And while I was helping them, I was learning too. And the more I learned about how they worked, the more I realized that so much of that could help museums. And when the museums reopened and I was back working on projects, I started sharing some of those things that I learned, some of those like behind the scenes, internal communications systems and processes. And it made a huge difference. And years later, I still hear from those museum clients who tell me that what I taught them set them up for success, and they're still seeing results. Because one thing that would happen is I would be brought on a communications project at a museum, and a lot of museums are short-staffed, they're burnt out, they're overworked, and I was the extra set of hands. But then when they called me back for the next project, it was they were still having all of those same sort of internal communications struggles. And so the saying, you can give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. You can teach a man to fish, he'll eat for a lifetime. I wanted to leave places better than I found them. And so, like I said, years later, I still hear from some of those museum clients who I was kind of teaching what I had learned in this online space, and they are still seeing the results. And so that's how Love My Museum was born. It's a suite of free and affordable services for museum professionals. And there's a podcast and a planning calendar and a metrics template and a digital assessment and hopefully more to come. And to me, Love My Museum, or the reason that I named it that, it has two meanings. So first, of course, we want visitors to love your museum so much that they come back and they bring a friend. But just as importantly, we want your employees to love working there so that they stay. Because too many museums are struggling with staff shortages and burnout. And that's what I think a lot of times they don't have the processes and the systems in place, that internal communications bit. And so that is kind of the two sides to Love My Museum.
So it's as much about internal communications as is external, but it's also interesting that I think a lot of times, and we see this in museums, the whole heritage space. You see it
Yes.
in preservation, museums. There's a lot of overlap between those things, archaeology, but this concept that the work is so challenging, the projects and putting the money together, and right now that is really challenging. And it's like, oh, the last thing I can do is talk about it. Like
Yes.
I don't have time for that. So that's the one thing we'll let go. But I sort of joke, it's sort of like that, like sort of cliche, like pics or it didn't happen. Or, it's like if you don't talk about it and you don't tell people about it, I hate to say what's the point, because there's still a point in doing it, but you're missing a big part of it, and it makes it much more challenging to fundraise and all that kind of stuff. Do you find
Yes.
that there's just a barrier to people accepting that they have to do this?
Totally. Oh my gosh. So I just got back from the Small Museum Association conference last week. And actually, I think my next podcast episode is going to be exactly what you talked about. Because so many times, when I'm talking to people at that conference, and I get it, like I get it. They'll say something like, oh, I just don't have time for that, or I can't afford financially or time wise to even think about that. We have a hole in our roof, or we need a new front door. And honestly, Nick, I want to say, but it doesn't matter if people don't know that you exist and aren't coming to see you. And it's hard to explain that correlation between having that having that fan base, having those people that love your space. I always say that every museum has to be a community museum. And that translates into donor dollars, memberships. Like you need that foundation of, the other thing that I heard a lot at the conference was, well, how do we just get or how do we get visitors in the door? And while that's a really good question to ask, that's not actually the question. Like for your museum, and when I say museum, I mean historic homes, historic properties, even nature centers, accredited zoos, children's museums, sculpture gardens, like that's my museum word. But in order for your museum to survive, you need to get visitors in the door. But in order for your museum to thrive, you need to have an experience where they want to come back and bring a friend and buy the t-shirt and buy the membership and buy tickets to your events and become a donor. That's what museums need.
Yeah, not just trick them to get them in the door once, and then they're like, "I am never," because we've all had that experience.
Yeah.
We won't name names, but we'll be like,
Yes.
"Not going back there."
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. You want the experience, and I've had these too, where you're like, I barely was even able to see all of that. I can't believe what I paid for and what I got. Like that's the kind of experience you want. And that doesn't mean it has to be huge or voluminous or out of this world. It can just be a really great experience or just a really stunning or beautiful place to experience.
Or even, oh my gosh, that volunteer was so nice and welcoming and helpful. Like that makes a difference too, which
Right.
is
Or
why
the
that,
alternative.
yeah, right, exactly. Which is why that internal communications piece is so important and so often overlooked. You
So
want people to be happy.
Yeah. So one of the things that you offer that I think is interesting that people should take a look at, and obviously we'll put a link in the show notes to Love My Museum. You got a podcast there, so you've got podcast listeners here. So it's an audience that knows what that means. We'll talk a little bit about the podcast in a second, but the museum digital assessment. Talk to us about what that is. I think it's fascinating.
So this was it's a fairly new service that I just started. This is something that I do with all of my clients, but I kind of do it sort of on my own and behind the scenes. That was so valuable to them that they said, Amy, you really should offer this as like a standalone service. And it goes back to that visitor experience. That visitor experience starts long before they arrive. So it very, very seldomly these days do people just stumble upon your front door, right? They're looking at you. They're looking at your website. They're looking at your social media. They're looking to see, they're trying to plan their visit before they get there, and you want to make it easy for them. And you also want to show up consistently on social media, in your website. And so that museum digital assessment kind of gives a museum like, okay, this is sort of the state of your digital presence. And this is a really good starting spot. This is the start of your visitor's experience with your museum. This needs to be great. Like, this needs to be top notch. This is how you kind of start to win them over and help them love your museum.
And it's interesting. I mean, we get asked this. Obviously, I'm not a communications professional. I work in preservation and we talk a lot, but people are sort of ask us about that. Well, where do we need to be? How do we need to do this? How do we need to do that? And I always feel, and I'm curious what you think about this, that it's like, you don't have to be all things to all people on every single platform, but the ones that you're on, you should be good on. So if that means you can only be on two or you can only be on one, and that's the place you can be best, then do that. But don't be on so many that people go to your Facebook page and they're like, this hasn't been updated since 2018.
Yes.
Maybe they're not really a thing anymore.
Yes.
Because we've all had that moment. And then you're like, oh no, they're still a thing. It's all on Instagram now.
Right.
And it's like, just get rid of that thing if you can't do it. So I feel like people maybe get sort of exhausted or just sort of, they're like, I can't do all of this. But you don't have to do all of it. You just have to, whatever you do, you should do well, which sounds sort of like cliche, but would you agree with that?
No, I would agree with that. And I would also say, like, use the tools that you can to make it easier on yourself. Repurpose your content. Instagram and Facebook are tied together. You can post on them at the same time with very little extra effort. And also remembering that social media isn't a billboard. It's like it's a town square, right? It's two-way communication. Don't just think of it as like a place to advertise your next event. Be sure that you're interacting. Be sure that it's a two-way street. And so be sure that you're using the space on social media to interact with your followers and your audience there.
Yeah. If you went into a public square and someone just came up and yelled at you about their next crab feed, you'd be like, oh, okay, good to hear about it. But if they came up and they had an exhibit about something and you read about it and they said, oh, if you're interested in this kind of thing, we have an event coming up. That's a very different experience, right?
Right.
But
Totally.
For some reason in the digital world, we sometimes just yell.
Yes.
So less all caps, more conversations.
Yes.
So talk to us about your podcast. So what can people expect when they find it?
Yeah, so the Love My Museum podcast, it's almost a year old. It's a baby podcast. I started it last April, and it really is for museum professionals. I try really hard to make the episodes short so that they're easily digestible. My audience is museum professionals. I know they don't have a lot of time. I want it to be something that they can listen to while they're uh, driving to work or walking from the parking garage or, at their lunch break. Like I want it to be something that is something that they can use and take action. So, like I said, I try to make them short. That doesn't always work out, but that's kind of what I strive to do.
And is it interviews like this? Is it more commentary? Like, what can people expect to hear when they listen?
Since I started in April, I would say most of it is commentary. Um, I really would like to, well, I do have plans, and probably in the next 6 months, there'll be a lot more interviews with other museum professionals and also with some experts that I've met and that I know who can talk about the communications pieces that I like to talk about, so that it's more like a conversation style.
And for people who are listening and they're like, well, two thoughts here, two questions, I guess. One, if you had like one, just sort of someone's listening and they're like, my museum needs help in every way when it comes to communications. I mean, obviously, go to Love My Museum, kind of dig into some of that material. There's a lot there that's both free and then affordably priced, as you say. But what's like a good first thing for them to think about? Is it that assessment? Is it just kind of seeing if they don't even know what's heads or tails or where to begin? What's your sort of like simple advice for that level of concern?
The first thing I would do, so on my website, lovemymuseum.com, there is a free planning calendar. Making a plan is a great first step. So working through that planning calendar and just thinking, even I actually recommend, like, let's just look at the next 90 days. Like, let's see what you have going on. Let's see what you have to plan for. And that could be like a new exhibit, but it could also be like, what are we going to post on social media? What updates do we need to do for our website? And scheduling those in. And my biggest pro tip is, when you are planning, do it as a team, do it all together, and don't forget, I really think, especially post pandemic, that our lives are not just our 9 to 5. Like, especially when you are a small museum and you have a small team and you're planning, make sure you include, like, this person's going to be out for their vacation this week, so that you're not burning your staff out and that you're taking all of your resources, not just money, but also people's time, that you're taking all of that into consideration.
Yeah, no, it's a obviously very sage advice from someone who knows what they're talking about. So there's a good reason to head over to the website. What's you kind of teased that there's some interviews coming. There's more work on the podcast. What else are you working on? It seems like you've always got something cooking.
I do. I do. The big thing I really am working hard on is I want to do a small group program, probably for small museums, although not limited to, where I'm kind of going through all of the things that I talk about on the podcast and in my blog posts, and sort of these frameworks for external communications and internal communications. And we would work through them in a small group. So you would have me there to sort of guide you, but you would also have that support system of other museum professionals. That's the big thing on my list. And maybe write a book.
Okay, just a few little things.
Just a few little things.
Pull together groups, do more interviews, write a book,
Yeah.
put on a Broadway show.
Yeah.
So
I love Broadway shows. That's a great idea.
There you go. See? All right. Well, before we go, we always ask people their favorite historic place or site. So what's speaking to you currently?
I need to have two. I couldn't choose between these two. So the first one is my historic hometown of Berlin, Maryland. It's located outside of Ocean City,
And
Maryland, on the Eastern Shore.
and I just got to jump in. It is charming. I mean,
It,
it really, and I mean, they, from a preservation standpoint, have done an incredible job of activating that community. So, yeah, that one, I don't think that's been mentioned ever before, but that's a great lead
okay.
off.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, I believe the town started as a crossroads, and colonial travelers would stop at the Burley Inn. So the name comes from the contraction of those two words, not named after the town in Germany, but named after Burley Inn. And I believe it started the like village at that crossroads started in the 1790s, although I think it was incorporated later. It's the famous for its being the birthplace of Stephen Decatur, a naval war hero, popular filming location, especially The Runaway Bride. My mom's family, my ancestors came to Maryland in the mid to late 1600s, and they made their way from Somerset County up to Worcester County, probably around that time that Berlin was being formed. And my parents still live there in the house that I grew up in, that my great uncle built. So that's my first shout out. But I couldn't leave out Gwen Park, which is a historic property in Brandywine, Maryland. It's my maiden name is Dyson, and so my other side of the family, my paternal side, lived in that house for about 100 years. They lived in Gwen Park. My dad grew up there. He went to Gwen Park High School. My grandmother taught there, and the house was given to my great grandmother Susie Hunt by her father when she married, and it was constructed in 1857, I think. And it's preserved because it's a great example of Greek revival style of the 1800s architecture.
That works.
Yeah.
It all sounds right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I love
Yeah.
Greek revival, so I'm with you.
It's a
And
great house.
yeah, and it's great that it has a sort of that familial connection. We get so many different answers. People talk about great architecture, they can talk about great places, they talk about great communities. We always tease that we're going to put together for the past 300 plus episodes a map of all the places, because we've got some really weird ones, some really like weird in a great way ones, like historic bathrooms and all sorts of interesting things in there.
Oh, that's a great idea. I love that idea.
Yeah, we need to do that. That would be a good digital asset for us. Well, this has been so much fun to talk with you about. When you have the small group thing together, we should have you back and like talk about that and tease that as a opportunity for people to get engaged, because I know we have a lot of museum listeners. The episode we just recorded was about a small museum, so we love our small museums, and it was just a pleasure having you on. So good to talk with you.
It was so nice to meet you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.